Hello and thanks for joining. I am Justin Kaltenbach, the CIO of Health IT Squared, and this is the second part in a four-part series on OHMPI, which is Oracle Healthcare Master Person Index. In this part, we are going to focus on a product demonstration of OHMPI, and we're going to take a quick look at Master Index Data Manager. Master Index Data Manager, or MIDM as we sometimes call it, is the primary user interface for users, that is, to interact with the product. It presents means of looking at what is actually in your system, meaning the data that's there, your patient or provider data, member data, that too. Additionally, we can run things like reports and manage potential duplicates, so there's some workflow aspects to it. So MIDM is really, again, the primary means for a user to interact with a product. Beyond MIDM, then we have to look at using an API layer to interact with a product. So that means a third-party application or system or some other system of any sort is calling the API structures and causing interactions with it. So when we get into MIDM, the focus of this product to keep in mind is that the role of user who's typically accessing Master Index Data Manager tends to be that of a data steward or a medical records clerk. It's not really a clinician or clinical end user focused application. And that is, those clinical users are typically in their existing applications, such as an EMR or some patient portal or provider portal, whatever it may be, those kinds of users and the general pool of users accessing the healthcare information are going to continue to run in their same applications today. It's really the stewards of data and those managing medical records that typically will be working in this product. So that said, I'm going to switch windows here and load up my demonstration environment. So I have this running locally on my laptop. When I launch the browser, in this case I'm using Firefox, I'm presented to a login screen. So Master Index Data Manager is fully web-based. All you need is a browser. There are no special plugins. You can also see there are some options here for different languages that have been implemented in the product. So I'm going to enter my username and password, and in this case I'm logging in as an administrative user. The thing to keep in mind is that this is role-based when you configure the product, so you can have different roles and different users with different permissions, and it affects the options that we see in the menus at the top here right off the bat. So I logged in as an admin, as I said, and I'm giving access to just about everything, or really everything. A user with more restricted privileges may have maybe just access to the reporting menu here, or the ability to manage potential duplicates, but they may not have access to the dashboard. The other thing to note is that we can control the landing page. So in this case, I've set my system up to land on the record detail screen, which means I can do queries and lookups and view data in our system. But in a lot of cases, we see folks and clients deploying with a dashboard as the first screen. So in the dashboard, we get a quick summary of what's happening in our system. So in the last 24-hour period, what potential duplicates have popped up in our queue, what assumed matches or automatic matches have taken place, and a means to review those and undo if we find that there was maybe a mistake by the system. We also have the ability to jump and see some quick reports or do some record lookups or even comparisons, which is right here on the right-hand side. So just a quick run through of what we're seeing on the screen and some of the tabs, what they do. We're obviously on dashboard, and we can see what that does here. The duplicate records is a workflow queue where we can see potential duplicates that have been flagged by OHMPI. And again, these are records that exist between those high and low thresholds, and that means these are records that the system can determine if there was a match or not, so it's going to a human review for that, and so we'll see records on a split screen and comparison options in there when we get to that. Record details was the screen I was just on. That was just our way to do a lookup and view information. The assumed match report shows records in our system that have automatically been matched, meaning they're above the high threshold. And again, it's a means to review and undo if we find a mistake may have been made. The transaction log shows any form of transaction that's gone against a record or records, I should say. Example would be an add, an update, a merge, an unmerge, link, unlink, and so on. Any of those are changes to records, additions to records, whatever they may be. There are, an alteration to a record. So that log shows every single change and snapshots of those records as they have had changes over time. Reports is just a common reporting screen, set of screens where we can view statistics on our data. Source record, it's something that's not commonly used, but a nice to have in case we ever need it. It's actually a way for us to automatically force in, or, well, I should say insert a record into OHMPI. And commonly in a production environment, records are coming to OHMPI through some sort of API, and that's usually happening in a means of messaging. There's maybe HL7 messages flowing to OHMPI. Well, source record can simulate that by just presenting a screen where we can input data and input that record to the product. The last one there, audit log. Audit log is tied to users. So an audit log gives us a trail or a history to see what users have done. We can search broadly, meaning seeing what all users have done within a certain time or to a certain record. Or we can even input a username and see what they have done and even get specific or granular with filters to see, has a certain user looked at a certain patient's records and what did they see, what changes may have been made, etc. And that actually ties back to transactions. So a user record or user records in the audit log are tied to interactions or things someone does right here in Master Index Data Manager, whereas transactions can be any changes to a record. That could have come from updates in source systems. It could have come from a user in Master Index Data Manager as well. All right, so that said, that's a quick overview of what's available to us. We're going to go ahead and do some deep dives into these different modules now and take a look at some of the options and how the product actually works and what the user experience will be like. So I started here on record details. This is a way for me to look up and view information that exists in my index. As with the tabs, there are some role-based functions in here, and that actually has to do with the pull-down menu. So I, as an administrative user right now, have privileges to search by a variety of fields, as you can see on this screen. And these fields are customizable, so they just tie back to the structure, underlying structure of OHMPI, and we can choose any field in that structure we want to be able to search by. But again, as I noted, if we wanted to have more restricted access, such as a user with lower privileges, we could only authorize them to have access to the patient lookup form. And as you can see here, there's a very minimal number of fields, and they're basically ID fields. So in order for someone to look up a patient or a record in the system, they would need to know either the enterprise ID number or a combination of the system ID and local medical record or system record number that exists there. So again, I'm going to switch back now to a more broad screen for my demonstration purposes. And let's go ahead and input some data here and do a quick search. So I'm going to add, a record here, or a query I should say, for Morishita. And I'm going to put in a last name there and a partial address of 139. I go ahead and hit search. Now my results come, and they're displayed on the bottom portion of the screen. So I see that 11 records that come back from my query, and it's queried the index to do this. As I talked about in the first presentation on OHMPI, there's a two-step matching process that takes place. So by doing this query, it's actually executed both steps, and the bottom here is the result of both. So let's look at the first couple of records and notice some of the aspects of what came back and why. I do want to point out quickly before I do that what columns we have here. You see some very standard demographic columns, but on the right-hand side is a very important one, and this is the weight. Ultimately, this is the score that came out of the matching algorithms when it compared the input in my query, which was Morishita, last name, and an address of 139, to the records in OHMPI. And as you'll see, there are a couple records here on the top that have a higher score than the rest, 19.0 and then 13.06 and on, whereas many of these other ones down below are just 9.0. So off the bat, I could kind of visually see what had happened here, why we got these results. And Morishita being a last name in the search, I could see that, well, this first record has an exact match on the last name, as well as the second record having a phonetic match. So we're close, but not exact. Phonetically, they do look and sound the same, though. So we see why that is a higher score than the rest of these records that popped in. So the rest of these records all have 139 in their address at some point, part of it, even a P.O. box here, 139. And so that's the reason why we're seeing those. Now, this is all configurable in the system. You have the choice when you implement this product to define how loose or tight the searches are and the results that come back. In this case, for demonstration purposes, I have things set a little bit looser than a production system may. And that's so we can see more data. We can understand why the system's acting in certain ways. All right, so we focus on these first two as being probable matches. They've got the highest scores. What I actually want to do is copy a field here and then just do another search and look at the results after that. So I've grabbed the social security number. It's not a required field. We've got it in the system here just really to fill a void for an alternate identification number. So in this case, when I've done a new search, including the social security number now, I see the results here. And we can see that in these first couple of records where we had before, the weighted score has gone up. Now we've gone up to 24 and 18. Additionally, I can see some of these other records that used to be at 9, starting here and beyond, have gone down and even have a negative symbol there. So they've gone into below 0 or negative ranges. There's a couple in here with a 3.0. So if I jump to the social field where I recognize what's happening, I can see that there are 4 records that have come back with the same social security number, and that's why we've got them listed first. They've got the highest weights. But going below that, why did some of these other records drop way below that 9 that they were at before? And that's because a addition of a new field here has had a negative impact on the mismatches. So one of the things to point out is that OHMPI, when it's computing its scores, in some cases matches where they're positive or there is a match that takes place, it's going to bring up the score. And a mismatch a lot of times brings down the score. So what we learn here is that the more fields that we introduce into the matching process, meaning more fields that we have from our input or our data sources, the better the match we're going to get. We have more accuracy, whether that's helping to positively make a match or to prevent mismatches. In this case, we can see since we're weighting the social as a negative impact or higher negative impact, it's brought these others down. So I could continue and maybe input a couple other things here, like if I just put in Hill Avenue and hit search and we view our results, we can see that this first record has now jumped to 33, but if I change it to Hill Street, it's gone up to 42. So it's actually showing me that the inputs are breaking apart and being tokenized. So again, with address number 1, as we talked about in our first session, address 1 is broken apart into subcomponents, and now we can see that each of these components has been compared against the data that exists in OHMPI. All right, so now what I want to do is jump into one of these records, and I'm just going to click on this EUID for the first one here, which is George Morishita. And on this screen, I actually am in a search results mode still, so I have the ability to scroll in between records. If I hit this bar here, I can choose to jump to the next one, and we see Jeff Morishita. And again, I can continue to click through that search results list that we got on the previous screen. I'm going to jump back to the start. I really want to work with that first record, and here I scroll down to see a couple of options. So there's 2 buttons here that I want to look at: view history, view sources. So first I'm going to hit view sources. And when I view the sources, what we're seeing on the right 2 columns is the data as it's come from the source systems. We have 2 source systems in this case. PCC, which will say is Pacific Coast Care, and Cerner registration. If I hover over those dots, I can see the full name. So underneath PCC is the medical record number or system ID number that came from that particular system, as well as the same here for Cerner, which is begins in 998. We can see the data as it's come from both systems, and even scrolling down, I can see that there are differences. One system labeled this person as a female, the other as a male, and in some cases a system may have more data than another, such as religion and ethnicity. If I scroll down even further, we'll see some more fields here like address and phone number. These other fields don't have any data in them, so they're somewhat abbreviated, but you can see these blue subsections here represent data that is in the looping or repeating elements. And again, we can have multiple addresses, multiple phone numbers on file. So to tie back now to these 2 source records, which are in the right 2 columns, they all fall underneath this enterprise ID number, enterprise universal ID number of 2735, and that is the EMPI's record or master record or universal record for this particular person. The data that we see in this column is what we call the single best record or golden record, and what it represents actually is a hybrid of data that's come from the different source systems. So what do we do in the case of a conflict? One source says married, another says divorced under marital status, and you see the single best record here chose married. It's important that we have a means to resolve those kinds of conflicts and pick one or the other based on some sort of rules or options. And those are what we call our survivorship rules in the system. The survivorship rules allow us to maybe specify a particular source system that we want to use as our master for a particular field, or even all of the fields if we wanted to. Or we could say something more like, hey, take whatever the most recent value was. So if an address has been 123 Main Street for a while, and then we're provided with a new address, maybe even a date and time stamp of that address, we can look at that and determine if it's newer and use that as an updated address or primary address under the enterprise ID here, or single best record. Now, the concept of a single best record is so we have one single representation of the data for each individual person or entity within OHMPI. And that's important when we're doing things like lookups or viewing search results or managing registration data. The whole goal of putting an EMPI in place is so we don't have to manage multiple sets of data around the same person or entity. We want to be able to do that in one spot now. All right, the other button I wanted to show at the bottom here was the view history. And history essentially shows snapshots of the data and any changes that have taken place over time. So you could see the date and times here where the data was altered in some way or another. And again, it's all snapshot format. So it's very simple for us to look at the data and see what's changed over time. Maybe a new address, maybe a new phone number, whatever it may be. Maybe the marital status changed as well as the last name. All right, so that's it. We've looked at a couple of records here, or I should say a record and its couple of sources. What I want to do next is go to the potential duplicate workflow, because this is really the bread and butter of an EMPI and why we find it implemented. So I'm going to go ahead and just set my date and time range back and do a quick search. Actually, while that loads, I want to pop into a slide really quick, just as a reminder on how the process works and why we find records in that potential duplicate queue. So this is a slide that I presented in the first part of this series on OHMPI. And what it's representing is how the matching process works. So again, when we're comparing a couple of records here, we see that each field computes a score, and we get an aggregate total when we go across all fields. Then that score is weighed against two thresholds, a high and a low. And if it's above the high threshold, we say these records are so similar, they're the same, and they're an automatic match. We link them together. And if it's below the low, we're saying they're so different, they're two separate records. We keep them that way. In between that is a potential match, and that means is there's enough similarity for us to put this in a queue for a human to consider making that match decision. And in that potential match queue is where we are in this product in the demonstration. All right, so in our search results, as I've just gone back on my date to pull up a range of records here, I see some records, and I'm going to scroll down, and I just want to get to one with a couple of examples I'm trying to illustrate. So here's one, Patricia Long, and I can see here there's a visual bar that's got a score also tied to it, 84.25. So we'll talk in a minute what those score means, what that visual meter means. All right, I hit those down arrows, and it brings these two records into a comparison screen. So now, instead of a summary view, I actually have the ability to see all of the fields and what's being compared there. Again, that visual meter and that score being presented, 84. So what that score represents in our system is what the matching algorithms produce when comparing these two records. And you may remember from an earlier discussion, we talk about a high threshold. In the case of my system, I actually have the high threshold set at, I think it's 29. So what that means is any record above, or any matched records where the score is above 29 should be considered an automatic match. Now, that doesn't make sense when I say the score in this case is 84, but here's what's happened. We have a rule enabled in our system that says if the two source records come from the same source system, we want them to end up in the potential duplicate queue, and we do not want to automatically link them together. And the reason for that is many clients, when they implement an EMPI, they do so and use the feature of potential duplicate management in the queuer in here, essentially as a work list or a punch list to go into their source systems and make the resolution there. So think if you've got Cerner as your registration system, or Epic, and there's duplicate records that the EMPI detects. If we link those records together in EMPI and recognize the similarities, that's fine and that's useful to some degree, but it's not really solving the problem of fixing the duplicates in a particular source system. And so if we use this duplicate management as a punch list to go down through a queue and view the pairs of records that have been flagged here, we can actually use this as a work list to go into Epic or Cerner or whatever our registration system may be, and actually fix the source of the problem there and try and use that to prevent future duplicates from being entered. So because these records, again, are coming from the same source system, is why we're seeing them in our queue here. And if these two records were from two different systems and had a score here of 84, with a decimal after that, they would have automatically been linked together and would have been categorized as an assumed match, and they would have never really shown up in this potential duplicate queue. Now, this is a feature, it can be turned on or off. You may choose to use the same source system rule, or you may choose not to. It's purely an option or a flag we can turn on or off. All right, so in this case, we're going to say, yeah, these two are the same records, and I just highlight those columns and I hit preview, which executes our survivorship rules and generates a new single best record for me to take a look at. In this view, I can see what decisions were made by the survivorship rules. The differences between these records have been highlighted in yellow, and I can see in this case that it looks like most of the record data, if not all of it, has come from this EUID that ends in 555. If I decide to override any of that, I could just simply click on one of those fields and say I don't want Asian as the race, or I do want Asian. I have the option to toggle back and forth. It's up to me as a records clerk or data manager to make these decisions. So when I'm done and satisfied with my options here, I go ahead and hit the merge button to confirm. And again, this is a soft merge. It's really just a linkage in EMPI. We can always go back and undo or change these associations at any time. All right, I confirm that. And we've now linked together Patricia Long. We'll get a confirmation here on the screen. So if I hit view sources in this case, I can see the source system data, where it originated from, and I can also see the single best record here on this EUID column. And again, as I noted before, I said these were both from the same source system, and we can see that visually here from PCC. So you see that these two medical record numbers from Pacific Coast Care are essentially sequential, so it's pretty obvious that a user made a mistake and entered the same person twice by accident. 872, 873. So again, we would use this as a punch list to go into Pacific Coast Care, which is, let's say, Epic or Cerner, and make the fix there. Because when we make merges or linkages in OHMPI, it doesn't necessarily mean we fix the problem on the source system. It means we found a duplicate, whether they're in the same system or across multiple disparate systems, and we create that linkage, but we're not necessarily fixing them like I noted. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit, because there is a way, if we wanted to, that we could actually have the merges and linkages that take place in OHMPI actually process or send a message to any downstream system to process and maybe do a merge. All right. So we've gone through the record details screen. What I want to do next is go to the assume match report. And again, I'm just setting the date range back here, so I get some records in there. But you can also see from this input form, there are several options for how we can query the data and do our lookups in the system. So we get our search results, and we can see that a lot of these records have very high scores, so well above the 29 threshold. And I can scroll through the results screen here if I want. So if I just pick any of these and view the details of that assumed match transaction, I just hit this icon, or excuse me, this hyperlink under EUID. And what it does is it shows me the data. I hit view history. I can see what was linked together and what came before. And I have the option at this point to undo it. So let's say I determined that, hey, These records should have never been linked together. This was a mistake. I can undo the match, and right now we'll just remember Don Lane, so I'm going to search that in a minute. So I hit undo match, gives me a confirmation. I hit OK. And now if I go back to record details and I search Don Lane, I should see at least 2 records that have come up here, and I do recognize that these are the 2 that were separated. So it was successful. So that assume match report, again, to summarize, is where I can go to view records that have been automatically linked together and view that transaction log and override that decision if I wanted to unlink them. All right. Next, let's take a look at the transaction log or transaction history. So transactions are changes to records. Transaction log could be done by users, or I should say transactions in the system could have been invoked by users in Master Index Data Manager, like I just did a merge and an unmerge. Those are transactions that we'll see. In fact, if I set the date range just back to today and hit search, I can see the merges that took place here and an update. As well as if I set it back even further, maybe go back a year, there'll be maybe a little bit more history there, including records that have been added to the system and maybe some updates there if I scroll through, so we see that. We can search by user. So if it was a user originated action, we maybe put in their user ID. We can also filter for records that were updated or changed, or transactions that came in through an API layer if we wanted to. If I just do a quick pull down on this function, we can see what the different types of transactions that exist are. So it's a very straightforward list: add, activate, deactivate, merge, unmerge, update, even transfer a record. So pretty straightforward. We can also input different filters here, such as an enterprise ID number or a system and local ID number, which basically is a Cerner system and then a particular medical record number there as well. So again, transaction log, very focused towards changes to records, whether it came from a user or a system, they're all displayed in here. Also, I'll note there's some print functions. Every report screen or a lot of the results screens in the product have a print button, which creates a little more friendly view, and that'll pull up. Actually, I input some criteria here and that affected it. Set that back. Maybe just go to today and hit print report. There we go. That's a little better. So you can see a little more simplified view of the data without some of the clutter that exists with the rest of the web page here. All right, that jumps us next to audit log. Audit log works similarly, where we can see changes and updates and things that have happened to records, except in this case, we're only looking at records or changes or functions as a result of a user within Master Index Data Manager, within this web application. So if I do the pull down menu for function, we can see a list of the different options in here. And in that function menu or pull down, you can see it's quite more detailed, because there are many different actions users can take within Master Index Data Manager. Anywhere from adding records to merging, unmerging, even searching records and viewing search results. So everything that I've done today as part of this demonstration has been logged in our audit trail. And you can see there's 100, which is the cap I had set, but over 100 records just from the brief demonstration I've done today with you. And if I scroll through some of these, we can see some of the different actions that have taken place. So if I just maybe restrict this or filter it down to merge, or it actually may be EUID merge confirm. There we go. We can see what took place today. All right. So a couple more things to take a look at. Reports. It's a very straightforward structure for reports. We load the screen here and we have a few different tabs, 6 different reports to run. So a merged transaction report does exactly what it says. It shows what records have been merged, at what date or time. And actually I want to go back a little bit further just to get some more records in here. For some reason, I'm not getting full details of data in here. We can see only one of the records is showing the first name and last name, and I may have messed something up. Again, forgive me for that. It's a demonstration environment, and sometimes I break things. Deactivated records. This happens when a particular source system has merges that occur on it. So in a registration system, when a merge takes place, the old record ends up being deactivated. And I don't have any deactivated records in my demo environment, but when a record's deactivated, we can flag it so in OHMPI, which means the data can still exist there, but we don't consider it an active record anymore because it doesn't technically exist or is not no longer active on that particular source system. Unmerged transaction report is, again, exactly as it sounds. This particular report can represent the data that you see in the assumed matches. Updated records, when is any form of update taking place, new address, new phone number, new name. Activity report is kind of cool because it shows us what users have done. And if I just go to yearly activity and I want to select 2012, at a very high level, it'll show you the different transactions that have taken place. So adds, updates, merges, unmerges, and so on, activation, deactivation. So you can see that we added 58,000 records and there were 170,000 flags and potential duplicates just within the last year. We can break this down yearly, monthly, weekly, even daily. And lastly, potential duplicate report. It represents the same data that we saw on our duplicate record screen, except it's in a report format. That's all. All right. The last tab to jump through and take a quick look at is the source record screen. And again, we don't very often use this function or feature in the product, but basically, we would go in here if we wanted to add a record and input it via a web form, as opposed to it normally coming in through a standard means like an API layer. So that source record here, we take and provide what source system we're saying it's from, as well as the local ID or medical record number there. Oops, I deleted that. So if we wanted to force it in, I key it in and hit validate. If it accepts it as a new record or a ID that does not exist yet, it'll present the form, and in here I can fill out the data on that particular person or patient. So fields, again, that are in our looping area have their own options. So if I add an address, I can add multiple if I wanted to, and the form here allows me to do that. All right. Well, that's it for our quick and dirty overview of Master Index Data Manager. Couple key points on that particular piece that I'd like to highlight again is that it's really geared towards the end users being your data steward type role. It's not something that clinicians are going to be in. That clinicians tend to stay in the same systems that they're using today and are familiar with today. And the EMPI is a process that acts on the back end to manage, maintain the information, and help improve the integrity of it. So when we have cases where we want to view reports or manage potential duplicates, that's when a data clerk or some sort of administrator would come in, and that's who would use Master Index Data Manager. So I appreciate you watching our presentation, and be sure to check out the other additions on OHMPI. In the next one, I'm going to focus on the configuration of master, the EMPI, OH MPI, and we'll look at how we configure it, how we set the weights, how we set the ranks, what configurations are available, what rules can we set, how do we alter the structure of data, and so on. A quick overview of Health IT Squared. As I mentioned in our first presentation, we're an Oracle Gold partner, and among the few that have been selected for the healthcare products. And we've been working with OHMPI for over a decade, our team, and we've got quite a bit of expertise in that product, as well as many others around healthcare and health information. So we encourage you to take a look at our website if you have any questions, and if you ever would like to reach out to us or see a demonstration of the product, my contact information now on the slide here. And we appreciate your time once again. Thank you.